I was setting out the teacups when the clock struck noon, the kind of hollow chime that echoes longer in an empty house. The good china felt too heavy in my hands, as though it knew company wasn't coming. I poured hot water anyway, watching steam curl like questions I didn't want to answer. This is just the start of how a lie about being broke revealed the truth about my family. Tell me, where are you watching from? I had expected the doorbell to ring, expected voices and footsteps filling these rooms the way they once had. Instead, the silence thickened. My children hadn't vanished overnight. They had faded one unanswered call at a time. That was the moment it struck me. Not poverty, but abandonment. And yet, beneath the ache, a sharper truth was waiting. The will I had written would one day speak louder than their silence ever did. So let's get into what happened after that first silence. At the beginning, I told myself not to panic. People get busy, schedules overlap. My children had families of their own, and I knew what it meant to juggle work, school, dinners, and all the ordinary pieces of life that fall into place when you're raising kids. I didn't want to assume the worst, so I waited. The first week wasn't bad. My daughter sent a text. "How are you holding up?" I typed back, "Fine, just trying to figure things out." That was all. No questions about bills, no offers to stop by. Still, I gave her credit for remembering. My son called once, late at night, his voice flat as if he had one ear on the television. "It'll be all right, Mom. You always figure things out." I wanted to believe that was comfort, but it sounded more like dismissal. By the second week, the silence stretched longer. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the mornings, staring at the empty chairs, recalling when those same seats were filled with bickering children, cereal boxes, and slammed textbooks. I used to wish for quiet back then. Now the stillness pressed in like a weight. I tried to keep myself busy. I paid the light bill, walked down to the corner store for milk, checked the mail every afternoon. These small acts became rituals, proof that I was still here even if nobody else seemed to notice. Each envelope I opened carried its own reminder. You owe this much, due on this date. Nothing unusual, just the constant hum of responsibility. I told myself the children would show up on the weekend. Saturday came and went. Sunday afternoon, sunlight slid across the front lawn, and I caught myself listening for car doors slamming, for hurried footsteps on the porch. No one came. I poured tea again, sat with 2 cups, then poured one down the sink. It's strange how hope can wear you out. After 3 weeks, I stopped expecting the phone to ring. Instead, I began replaying conversations in my head, searching for signs I might have missed. When I first mentioned being broke, did I sound too casual? Too final? Did they hear it as my failure or as a request? For help? I remembered my daughter's face at 12 years old, standing in the doorway after I'd worked a double shift, asking if I was too tired to help her with her science project. I had pushed through, taped cardboard planets onto fishing wire, and told her Saturn's rings deserved extra glitter. She'd hugged me then, proud, grateful. I wondered when that girl had vanished, replaced by someone who couldn't be bothered to visit when I said I had nothing left. One evening, I pulled out the family photo albums. Dust clung to the covers and the plastic sleeves stuck together as I turned the pages. Smiling faces at Christmas, camping trips with soggy tents, graduation gowns too long for their legs. The proof of a life built around them. I sat there with those photos scattered across my lap and whispered into the quiet, did none of it matter? A week later, I ran into my neighbor, Evelyn, while trimming the rose bush. She asked if the kids had been around lately. I forced a smile. They've been busy. Evelyn gave me a look that said she didn't believe me, but she didn't press. Instead, she offered me a container of soup and asked if I needed help with groceries. The kindness stung. My children lived miles away, yet a neighbor noticed what they didn't. That night, I wrote in my journal. I wrote down the date, what I'd eaten, and how many days it had been since I'd heard from them. My hand shook as I wrote, maybe this is how it ends. Not with anger, but with distance. Still, a part of me wasn't ready to accept it. I tried calling. Once, twice, straight to voicemail. I left simple messages. Just checking in? Hope you're all right. No response. After a while, even leaving those words felt foolish. The house seemed larger with every passing day. Rooms I used to clean out of habit stayed untouched. I left the dust on the guest room dresser. I stopped vacuuming the upstairs hallway. What was the point? No one was coming. By the end of the month, I realized I'd been conducting an experiment without meaning to. I had told them I was broke, and they had disappeared. My fear had turned into evidence. Evidence that love, once tested, had failed. But here's the thing, I wasn't actually broke. My savings, my pension, and the investments your father and I had built were still intact. They didn't know about the will I had quietly updated, the one that held the truth of what I thought they deserved. I had wanted to see their hearts before I revealed the numbers. Now I knew. That night, after admitting the truth to myself, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the old clock tick down the hallway, each second louder than the last. It wasn't poverty that had emptied the house. It was their choice. And that truth gnawed at me more than any unpaid bill ever could. I thought about calling again, maybe pretending I had good news just to see if they would answer. But I stopped myself. If I had to bait them with promises, then the answer was already clear. I wanted to believe love was stronger than money, but the silence around me told a different story. In the mornings, I tried to fill the hours. I cleaned out closets, sorted through old letters, and went through the basement where boxes had sat untouched since my husband passed. Dust coated the lids, but inside were reminders of years when family still meant something. My children's school projects, boxes of toys, stacks of Christmas ornaments. Every object felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the memory of better days. By the second month, I stopped expecting their voices. The phone on the wall might as well have been decoration. When it rang, it was only telemarketers or distant cousins calling once a year. Never the voices I wanted most. One afternoon, I walked to the park near the library. Families were out with their kids, pushing strollers, tossing balls, feeding pigeons. I sat on a bench and watched, trying to imagine if I had been too hard on mine. Did I expect too much? Was telling them I was broke some kind of trap they resented? But then I remembered. It hadn't been a trick. It had been honesty. And instead of staying, they vanished. The loneliness grew sharper in the evenings. That was when I used to hear their laughter on the phone, or when one of them would stop by after work. Now I ate dinner at the table alone, the sound of utensils clinking against plates filling the space where conversation used to be. I began writing more in my journal. Not just dates, but thoughts I couldn't say aloud. I wrote about the way the house felt different now, how the air seemed still, how the quiet could press against my chest until I struggled to breathe. I wrote about missing them, even when I knew they didn't miss me. And I wrote about the will, about how the money would go where it was deserved, not where it was expected. Evelyn came by again one evening, bringing a loaf of bread she'd baked. She asked if I'd heard from the children. I shook my head. She hesitated, then said softly, "Some people show who they are when things get hard." I nodded, though my throat tightened. It hurt to hear it spoken aloud. But she was right. It wasn't just the absence. It was the way they had disappeared so easily, as though I were a burden they could set down. That was what cut deepest. A stranger offering bread noticed me more than my own children. One morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to it fall. I thought about all the storms I'd weathered when they were small. Illnesses, scraped knees, broken hearts, and how I'd always been the one steady presence. Now, when the storm was mine, they were nowhere to be found. Weeks blurred together. I marked the passage of time by the changing flowers in Evelyn's garden across the street. First tulips, then roses, now daisies. My children hadn't seen any of them. The hurt turned into something else. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just clarity. I began to understand that I couldn't control their choices, only my own. And my choice was to stop chasing people who had already decided to walk away. That was when I made an appointment with my lawyer. I didn't need to. The will was already written, the accounts already set. But I wanted to add something, a note, a letter to be read with the will. Words they couldn't ignore. The lawyer, a patient man with gray hair and kind eyes, asked if I was sure. Families can be complicated, he said gently. I told him I wasn't cutting them out of spite. I was leaving them exactly what they had given me. Nothing. That night, I wrote the letter. My hand shook a little, but the words came easily. I told them I had loved them, that I had given my life to raising them, and that when tested, they had chosen absence. I explained where the money was going, to the neighbor who checked in, to the community fund at the library, to the people who had been present when it mattered. Not because of money, but because of care. I didn't write it to wound them. I wrote it so they would understand, even if it was too late to change. By the third month, the silence no longer surprised me. I still missed them, of course. I still thought of birthdays and holidays and wondered if their lives were moving forward without a glance back. But I stopped waiting at the window. I stopped setting out extra cups. The waiting had turned into living again, even if that life was smaller, quieter. And yet, in that quiet, there was something steady. I had been abandoned, but I hadn't been destroyed. I was still here, still making choices, still deciding where my story went next. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave me strength. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave me strength. The next morning, I walked to the library. I hadn't been inside in years, not since I used to take the kids for story time, bribing them with cookies afterward if they behaved. The building smelled the same, paper, ink, and the faint tang of floor polish. I sat at one of the long tables, opened a newspaper, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of waiting. I noticed the same people there often. A retired man who read biographies cover to cover. A young mother who used the computers to search job listings while her toddler stacked picture books. The librarian, Mrs. Grant, always nodded when she saw me, setting aside the large print novels she knew I could finish in a week. Small gestures, but they filled the silence my children had left behind. Evelyn stopped by almost daily. Sometimes she brought soup, other times just herself. She asked if I'd join her for her church's bake sale, or if I wanted to help her plant herbs in her back garden. I agreed, not because I was suddenly social, but because it felt good to be asked. My children hadn't asked me for anything in months. One evening, after she dropped off a pot of stew, I found myself telling her more than I had intended. About the will, about the letter, about the ache of their absence. She listened without judgment, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When I finished, she said, "Sometimes family is who stays, not who leaves." Her words lingered. Over the weeks, I started seeing Evelyn less as a neighbor and more as a companion. She had her own losses. Her husband gone for years. Her children scattered in other states. We joked that we were two women keeping each other's walls from closing in. She noticed when I hadn't opened the curtains in the morning. I noticed when she limped more than usual. These small exchanges began to build something steady. At the community center, I signed up for a volunteer shift. Nothing grand, just sorting donations for the food pantry. The people there didn't know my story, and they didn't need to. They just knew I showed up, and that was enough. One man, a widower, shared his sandwiches with me at lunch. Another woman insisted on giving me rides home when it rained. Their kindness wasn't tied to what I had or didn't have. It was tied to presence, to being seen. I couldn't help but compare it. My own children, flesh of my flesh, had chosen silence. Strangers, meanwhile, had offered me a seat at their table without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had believed blood meant everything, that no matter the fights, the distance, or the mistakes, family always circled back. Now I was learning that sometimes family was a choice, and sometimes the ones you didn't choose became the ones who showed up when it mattered most. Still, there were nights when grief caught me off guard. I'd hear a car door outside and think, just for a second, that maybe they'd come back. Or I'd set two plates on the table without realizing it. Old habits die slow, but each time the chair stayed empty, I reminded myself of the letter waiting with the will. I reread it often, wondering if I'd been too harsh. I hadn't written insults, only truth. You were absent when I needed presence. You turned away when I needed care. Each line was my attempt to explain, not attack. Still, part of me feared they would dismiss it as spite when the time came. Evelyn, when I finally showed her a copy, pressed her lips together and said, "It isn't cruel, it's honest. That's different." Her reassurance mattered. I realized with some surprise that her opinion mattered more to me now than my children's likely would. The months went on. The phone remained quiet, the mailbox held only bills and flyers. But I no longer stared at it with expectation. Instead, I filled the time with things that gave back. Sorting clothes at the pantry, reading stories to children at the library, sharing meals with neighbors who knew what it meant to miss someone. Through these routines, I found a strange kind of peace. My children's absence still ached, but it no longer defined every hour of my day. One afternoon, while watering Evelyn's garden, she handed me a packet of seeds. "Plant these in your yard," she said. "You'll want something new to look forward to." I smiled, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel forced. As I tucked the seeds into the soil back home, I thought about legacy. Maybe it wasn't money or property or even blood. Maybe it was the small acts of care you left behind. The neighbor's garden, the library's shelves, the pantry's shelves stocked for someone who needed it. That was something worth passing on, even if my children never saw it. And yet, beneath that calm, a question lingered. What would happen when they did return? Because deep down, I knew they would. Not for me, but for what they thought I had left. And yet, beneath that calm, a question lingered. What would happen when they did return? Because deep down, I knew they would. Not for me, but for what they thought I had left. That thought stayed with me for days. Each time I passed the drawer where the will was tucked away, I felt the weight of it. It wasn't enough to have the letter written. I needed to be certain that when the day came, there would be no confusion, no loophole for them to twist. I wanted my decision to be clear, permanent, and beyond dispute. So I called my lawyer and scheduled another meeting. The receptionist recognized my name and tone, and she slotted me in without hesitation. That morning, I dressed carefully. Not in anything flashy, but in the same blouse I'd worn when I first bought the house with their father. It was a reminder of the years when we'd built something from nothing, when family had meant more than figures on a page. The office was quiet, lined with thick folders and tidy desks. My lawyer, Mr. Benson, greeted me with a firm handshake. His face had the same patient expression he'd worn the last time, when I'd first told him about the changes. He gestured for me to sit, and I felt the leather chair creak under me. "I want to finalize everything," I told him. "I want it in writing that my children receive nothing, and I want the letter included to be read aloud." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Are you certain?" I hesitated only a second before saying, "Yes. I've waited months for them to prove me wrong. They didn't." He pulled out a file, flipping through the pages with careful hands. "Then we'll make it official." We spent an hour going over the details. The accounts, the property, the distribution. Evelyn would receive a portion, the library fund another, the food pantry the rest. Every choice reflected presence, not absence. Mr. Benson explained how it would hold up legally, how there would be no room for challenge. I listened, not with the confusion I'd expected, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. At one point, he looked up and said, "You know, it takes courage to do this." I shook my head. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like necessity." When I signed the last page, the pen left a dark line across the paper, sharp and final. My name, my choice. I felt a release, as if I had been carrying a stone in my chest and had finally set it down. Afterward, I walked out into the daylight. The sun was bright, and the air carried the sound of traffic from the main road. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I had acted. I had taken control of the one thing left that was truly mine. Back home, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It was simply my space. I looked around at the photographs on the wall, family portraits from years ago, and realized I didn't need to take them down. They were reminders of the years when love had been real, even if it had faded later. Nothing could erase that history, but nothing forced me to live in it either. That evening, Evelyn stopped by. I told her about the appointment, about the signatures and the files now locked away. She listened, then reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You did what needed to be done," she said simply. Her words steadied me. The following days passed with an odd sense of balance. I still missed my children, but the longing wasn't as sharp. Knowing that the will carried my truth gave me a strange sort of peace. It meant that even if they never came back or if they only returned for money, my voice would be heard in the end. Sometimes at night, I rehearsed in my head what they would say when they learned. I imagined the anger, the disbelief, the accusations. "You were unfair. You punished us." But beneath their words, I knew the silence of the past months would echo louder. Their absence had written this will as much as I had. I didn't feel proud exactly. Pride wasn't the right word. What I felt was steadiness. For the first time since admitting I was broke, I no longer questioned whether I had done the right thing. The truth had been revealed in their actions, and I had responded in kind. A week later, I planted the seeds Evelyn had given me. Tiny green shoots began to push through the soil, fragile but certain. I checked them every morning, watering carefully, watching them grow. They became a quiet reminder. Life continued, even in places where you thought nothing would bloom again. And as I knelt there in the dirt, I knew that one day my children would return, smiling too wide, their voices sweetened by sudden interest. And when they did, everything would already be decided. And when they did, everything would already be decided. It happened sooner than I thought. A cousin, the kind who relished gossip more than truth, must have let something slip. One afternoon, the phone rang, and for the first time in months, it was my daughter's voice. She sounded upbeat, almost giddy. "Mom, I was just thinking about you," she said, as if the long silence hadn't existed. I didn't call her out. I simply replied, "I'm here," and waited. She asked if she could come by that weekend. I agreed. My voice was calm, though my hands shook after I hung up. 2 days later, my son called. His tone was warmer than it had been in years. He told me he missed our Sunday dinners, that he was sorry he hadn't been around. Again, I listened. Again, I said yes when he suggested stopping by. By the end of the week, both of them were back in my living room, their voices bouncing off the walls as if nothing had happened. They asked about my health, about Evelyn, about the neighborhood. My daughter even brought flowers, something she hadn't done since her father's funeral. I smiled, poured tea, and let them talk. But beneath their chatter, I could hear what wasn't said. Their questions slid too easily toward money. Had I thought about selling the house? Was I managing the bills? Did I still have plans for the future? Each question was dressed as concern, but I heard the undertones clearly. That evening, after they left, I sat at the same table with the empty teacups and asked myself whether I felt glad or betrayed. The truth was complicated. I was glad to see them, to hear their voices filling the rooms again. But I also knew the timing wasn't coincidence. They had returned only after rumors reached them. In the weeks that followed, their visits grew regular. My daughter called almost every evening, checking on whether I needed groceries or errands. My son mowed the lawn without being asked. Neighbors nodded approvingly, thinking how wonderful it must be to have such attentive children. I smiled politely, but inside, I carried the weight of knowing better. I kept a quiet record, the way I had in my journal months earlier. The dates, the times, the sudden gifts and gestures. Not out of spite, but to remind myself of the truth if doubt ever crept back in. These weren't the actions of children rediscovering love. These were rehearsals, performances, carefully timed. One afternoon, Evelyn stopped by while they were visiting. She exchanged pleasantries with them, but I could tell she noticed. When they left, she leaned toward me and whispered, Funny how quickly they remember when there's something to gain. I didn't argue. As the days stretched into weeks, I played the role they expected. I smiled, thanked them for their help, and allowed their presence without revealing my thoughts. I didn't tell them about the letter waiting with the will or about the signatures that made it unchangeable. I let them believe what they wanted because I knew the truth would come soon enough. There were moments, though, when my heart wavered. Watching my son fix a loose shutter, I remembered him at 10 years old, hammer in hand, helping his father build a treehouse. Listening to Abby, my daughter washed dishes in the kitchen. I thought of her teenage years when she would sing loudly while drying plates. Those memories tugged at me, trying to convince me that maybe their motives didn't matter, that presence, even if shallow, was better than absence. But each time the doubt dissolved when I caught the quick glances they exchanged. When my daughter asked about the value of the car in the driveway, when my son suggested I might want to simplify my accounts, these weren't slips. They were reminders of why they had come back. One evening after they left, I stood by the window and watched their taillights fade. For the first time, I felt oddly calm. They thought they were playing a game, but the pieces had already been moved. The outcome was written, sealed, and waiting. I sat down with Evelyn the next morning and told her, "They're back." She raised her eyebrows. And? And nothing's changed, I said. Not really. She nodded. Then you know what you need to do. I did. All that remained was time, and the inevitable moment when the will would speak for me. All that remained was time, and the inevitable moment when the will would speak for me. It came on a gray morning, the kind where the sky looked heavy and the air carried a stillness that made every sound sharper. Mr. Benson had arranged for the reading in his office. I hadn't asked for it to be dramatic. It was simply procedure. But I knew, sitting there in the quiet waiting room, that for my children, it would be something else entirely. They arrived together, both wearing the practiced smiles of people who wanted to look united. My daughter carried a folder as though she had prepared notes. My son kept glancing at his watch, his leg bouncing in quick rhythm. They greeted me warmly, their voices a little too bright. I nodded, returned the politeness, and said nothing more. When Mr. Benson ushered us into his office, I sat across from them at the long wooden table. He opened a file, his glasses slipping down his nose, and began with the formalities. "This is the last will and testament." His voice was calm, practiced, unshaken by what he was about to reveal. My daughter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the papers. My son folded his arms, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as though he could already see the outcome. Mr. Benson continued, outlining the standard details: my identification, the property, the accounts. Then he reached the part that mattered. The estate, totaling approximately $1.2 million, will be distributed as follows. I watched their faces as the words landed. Evelyn's name first, then the library fund, then the food pantry. Each portion clearly described, each decision carefully documented. My children's names never came. At first, they didn't react. They blinked, nodded slightly as if they had misheard or expected a correction. When the silence stretched, my daughter spoke. "Excuse me, could you repeat that?" Mr. Benson adjusted his glasses. "Of course, the distribution is to Evelyn Harper, the Oak Street Library Fund, and the Greenway Food Pantry. There are no bequests to immediate family." My son's face flushed. He leaned forward. "There must be a mistake. We're her children." "There is no mistake," Mr. Benson said evenly. "The documents were reviewed, signed, and notarized. Your mother's instructions are explicit." My daughter turned to me then, her voice trembling between disbelief and anger. "Mom, how could you do this? After everything?" I met her gaze. "After everything, yes. This is exactly why." Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at her brother, who now gripped the edge of the table. "This isn't fair," he snapped. "We're family." I felt a steady calm wash over me. Family shows up when there's nothing to gain. You didn't. The room grew quiet except for the shuffle of papers. Mr. Benson, to his credit, stayed professional, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. He'd heard this kind of outrage before. My daughter tried again. We didn't know. We thought. You thought I was broke, I finished for her. And that was enough reason to disappear. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. I let them sit with it. The truth didn't need dressing up. It had already spoken in their absence, and now it was written in the will. Finally, my son pushed back his chair, the legs scraping across the floor. This is a mistake you'll regret, he said, his voice hard. I didn't flinch. This is the first decision I haven't regretted in a long time. They left the office in a storm of muttered words, the door slamming behind them. I stayed seated, breathing slowly, my hands folded in my lap. For months, I had feared this moment. But when it came, it felt less like a battle and more like release. Mr. Benson cleared his throat gently. You handled that well. I nodded. I wasn't sure I would. He closed the file. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one that finally sets things straight. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. The sky was still gray, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had lifted from it too. I walked down the steps slowly, each step deliberate, steady. That night, Evelyn came over with a pot of tea. I told her what had happened. Every word, every look on their faces. She listened quietly, then said, You did what they made you do. I sipped my tea and thought about that. Maybe it wasn't punishment. Maybe it was simply truth taking its place, undeniable and final. The house was quiet when she left, but it didn't feel empty anymore. For the first time in months, the silence felt earned. I woke the next morning expecting regret to creep in, but it didn't. I made coffee, buttered a slice of bread, and sat by the kitchen window. The street outside looked the same. Cars rolling past, neighbors tending their lawns. But something inside me had shifted. The decision was no longer a secret waiting to be revealed. It had spoken, and the world hadn't ended. The phone didn't ring that day. I suspected my children needed time to let the truth settle. Maybe they were angry. Maybe they were already plotting ways to challenge the will, but I didn't spend hours wondering. Instead, I walked to the garden and checked the shoots I had planted. They were taller now, pushing through the soil with steady insistence. Evelyn joined me later that afternoon. We sat in lawn chairs, sipping tea, the quiet between us comfortable. Do you feel lighter? She asked. Yes, I admitted. Not happy, not sad, just lighter. She nodded, as if she had known the answer already. The following week, I returned to the library for my volunteer shift. Mrs. Grant greeted me with her usual smile and handed me a stack of returns. As I shelved books, I realized how much I had missed this simple rhythm. Being useful, being part of something that asked nothing of me but time. The children at Story Hour waved at me, and I waved back, reminded that care didn't always come from where you expected. At the food pantry, the shelves needed stocking. I lifted boxes with the other volunteers, the weight grounding me in the present. One man thanked me as if I'd given him something extraordinary when all I had done was place cans in his bag. His gratitude stayed with me longer than my children's excuses ever had. At night, I wrote again in my journal. This time, the entries weren't filled with absence or silence. Instead, I recorded the small connections that stitched my days together. The neighbor's laughter, the librarian's nod, the smile of a child who recognized me. They weren't grand, but they were real. Weeks later, my daughter showed up unannounced. She stood on the porch holding a box of pastries, her eyes tired. I let her in. She placed the box on the counter and sat down heavily. I can't believe you did this, she said quietly. I can, I replied. She shook her head. We didn't know you felt that way. I leaned forward. You didn't ask. And when I told you I was broke, you disappeared. That told me everything I needed to know. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stared at the table, tracing a circle with her finger. So that's it? Were cut out? Yes, I said. Not out of spite, out of truth. She left soon after, the pastries untouched. I watched her walk to her car, shoulders stiff, and I felt the ache of finality. But I also knew I couldn't undo what had been written without betraying myself. My son never came back. He sent one message, angry, clipped, and then nothing. That silence, too, felt like proof. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The plants in my garden grew taller, some blooming in colors I hadn't expected. Evelyn teased me about having a green thumb, and I laughed, realizing it had been a long time since I had laughed freely. Legacy no longer felt like money or property. It felt like showing up at the library each week, or ladling soup at the pantry, or sharing a meal with Evelyn when the evenings grew long. It felt like choosing who deserved the best of me instead of assuming blood was enough. Sometimes I still looked at the photographs on the wall. I didn't take them down because they were part of the story too. They reminded me of the years when love had been present, when family dinners had been noisy, when birthdays had been celebrated without hesitation. I honored those memories even as I accepted that the people in them had changed. In the end, the will wasn't about money. It was about saying in the clearest way possible that presence mattered more than inheritance. That showing up when there was nothing to gain meant more than any promise. I couldn't change the choices my children had made, but I could make mine. And mine was to leave behind a legacy not of wealth, but of honesty. A legacy that told the truth, even when it hurt. And when the day finally came, I knew that truth would outlast silence. If this story of love, absence, and truth spoke to you, you'll be moved by what comes next. Follow the link to hear the true story of a grandmother whose simple recipe outsold a national brand and gave her a legacy no one saw coming. Don't miss it.